Africa went from a continent full of culture and life to a continent left poor and struggling. British imperialists changed Africa for the worst. They claimed they were colonizing in order to civilize a chaotic and dangerous people. They felt as if it was their duty to do what they did. They felt like they had good intentions. The negative effects outweighed the positive effects by far. African population was reduced by thousands. Their economy was destroyed, and the British made it easy for tyrants to swoop in and take over. They tried to make it seem like they were caring for the Africans and helping them, but they just wanted to take control. Africans' population was slaughtered by the thousands, starting with the Middle Passage. Hundreds of Africans shoved on a ship. Little food, but many diseases. African slaves began dying off in very large numbers. They would commit suicide by throwing themselves overboard when given the opportunity. Others died of starvation and poor conditions. The abuse and torment began to decrease the population greatly. Europeans would invade villages and ransack for the healthiest men and women, and since they would most likely take the men, it would cause villages to die out because of the lack of men in the society to help provide. Though this happened hundreds of years ago, it still affects the current population. Africa was never able to recover from the loss of all its people. The total amounts of abducted Africans are in the hundreds of millions, completely defecating the African population. While the British were in Africa, they took control of all the natural resources. Some of the resources which they took, and actually even are in control of today, are diamonds, copper, iron, cotton, and different types of cash crops. They began to trade all the continent had, but did not reinvest it back into the countries. The people were already poor to begin with, but because they were forced to do hard labor for near to nothing for items which they were needed to survive, did not promote healthy growth in economics for the African people. When they left the continent, it was stripped of its resources and left with a struggling economy. Since then, Africa has been struggling to improve their economy, but it is not up to what it could have been. African countries are some of the poorest countries on the face of this planet, and by far the poorest continent. After years of this kind of treatment, the Africans finally began to fight for their independence. One after one, the African nations won their independence and British began to leave. It was the perfect time for evil minds to take over. African nations were vulnerable, needing someone to rule, and these people swooped in and began to take over. They were absolute tyrants. They were corrupt leaders with an agenda of their own, ruining the lives of others and making it a living hell. Robert Mugabe, was one of the worst tyrants in Africa, is the president of Zimbabwe. He rules the country with an iron fist. Under his rule, the nation's economy went from bad to okay to horrific, with one of the worst inflation rates of all time. He's been able to stay in power through rigged and violent campaigns to guarantee his position. This is just one of many horrific leaders that the African people have had to deal with. Life for the people of Africa will forever be different due to the actions of the British imperialists.